very excited about today's panel. I'll give you a little bit information about the Ocean Conservancy. So for more than 50 years, the Ocean Conservancy has delivered effective, evidence-based solutions for the ocean and all who depend on it. Today, we continue to unite with science and people and policy to protect our ocean from the greatest challenge it faces, which of course is climate change, plastic pollution, and biodiversity loss. Together, we are securing a healthy ocean and a thriving planet forever and for everyone. My name is Kasha Patel. I'm a climate journalist, most recently at the Washington Post. I've written a lot about ocean pollution, a lot of problems. My last piece that was there was on the front page, and it was about the ocean. It was about the AMOC, Atlantic Marine Oceanic Circulation, which was really cool to see that priority given to our oceans in a public newspaper, mainstream newspaper. Today we're going to be discussing how climate change is impacting the ocean, the rich biodiversity that calls it home, and the communities that depend on it. So let me introduce our experts. First we have Fatima Candace Vahlsing. She is the Vice President for Climate at the Ocean Conservancy. She has served for more than 15 years in senior government climate positions at the international, federal, and state level, including 4 different White House offices for 2 presidents, as a diplomat at a national security agency, in the U.S. Senate, on a presidential transition team, and in the state of California, which is all very impressive. Next up, we have on my side, Meredith. She is the Senior Director of Ocean Conservancy's Fish Conservation Program. She oversees a team of scientists, economists, and advocates focused on ensuring that the U.S. fisheries are sustainably managed and support thriving coastal communities, particularly as climate change affects ocean ecosystems. She has nearly 20 years of experience advocating on environmental issues in Washington, D.C. Again, a very long time. And then last but not least is Hayden in the middle. He is a cohort member of the Ocean Conservancy's Tuutalik Youth Water Keepers. He is a lifelong resident of Kodiak Island in Alaska. Subapiak on his mother's side, Storm comes from a lineage with over 7,000 years of history on Kodiak Island. He made his first commercial halibut fishing trip with his father at age 8 and frequently fishes and hunts from the family skiff. He is currently pursuing a bachelor's degree in aviation technology from the University of Alaska Anchorage and is training to be a bush pilot, which is very cool. Thank you all for submitting your questions. We're going to try and get through as many as we possibly can. But first off, Fatima, can you explain to us the connection between the ocean and climate change?
Absolutely. That's for all here, right?
Yes.
So, the ocean and climate change. So the ocean is both a life raft and also a victim of climate change. So I don't know if you all know this, but I'm going to throw out a few facts. The ocean absorbs 90% of the heat we give off. It produces every second breath that we breathe. It absorbs about 1/3 of the pollution, the carbon pollution that humans produce. And it feeds billions of people, as you all know. So the ocean has been working as an engine of climate change to help regulate climate change for centuries. Unfortunately, that comes at a cost. So right now we're seeing multiple impacts to climate change across the ocean. It's getting more acidic, it's getting hotter, you all are familiar with sea level rise, and each of these things individually would obviously have their own devastating impacts, but when you combine them together, it's changing the ocean as we know it. So that's why we're here at Ocean Conservancy, trying to figure out how we can actually take these changes and turn them into a solution. And so what we're doing on my team is we're focused a lot on how we can mitigate the impacts of climate change. So reducing greenhouse gas emissions, pulling down carbon out of the atmosphere into potentially the ocean if technology proves right. For example, just throw out a few things we're working on. Offshore wind is one of the things we are working across the world to try to catalyze more offshore wind. So that's working with countries to try to include ocean climate solutions in the plans that they submit to the UNFCCC. Right now, I have 3 people from my team in London helping negotiate the International Monetary Organization, a framework that would actually be one of the potentially first global carbon taxes or global carbon agreements on shipping. So we work on a variety of different technologies, mainly to use the ocean, as I said, as a life raft and as a solution to climate change versus just talking about it as a
Great. So we're going to talk about some more of the solutions and more that later on. Meredith, can you tell us about how biodiversity is
Yeah, of course. So it's all connected. The ocean ecosystems, all the way, from plants and plankton all the way up to whales, every piece of that is experiencing some form of a climate impact, and it's really disrupting and sort of reshuffling the deck of our ocean ecosystems in a lot of really profound ways that have impact not just on individual species, but on assemblages of species, on whole ecosystems, and how it all works together. So I'm going to give you a few crash course examples. One of the things that we think about that drives a lot of productivity in the ocean, that's like how many fish and other marine species are out there and how they're doing, is something called primary production, which is that, like, how do we produce plankton and other sorts of little tiny creatures that are doing the work of bringing in energy from the sun and creating them into something that other things can then eat. So primary production in the last 25 years across almost half of the ocean has declined by 7% already. That's the average. In some places it's much worse, and many of those are biodiversity hotspots, so your tropical or subtropical ecosystems. When you have that shortfall in primary production, every piece of the food web that depends upon that energy transfer is suffering or experiencing some form of an impact, because we are already hollowing out the bottom of the food chain, and it works its way all the way up to everything else. In fisheries, we're seeing globally already, since 1930, a 4.3% decrease in fish populations. And that sounds small, but we actually take very little to feed ourselves out of that. A lot of that has to stay in the ocean, so that can have really profound impacts on ocean ecosystems. Even that level of decrease can have a really big deal. Some areas, fish populations have already declined by 15 to 35%. So it can be really a huge impact. There are other major impacts that are happening, like stocks are shifting, fish stocks are shifting to cooler and deeper waters. That can mean that they're not where people rely on them for food or industry. It also means that maybe they're not there when a predator stock comes through that depends upon them. So you see these mismatches between predator and prey and where they are, and that can cause some real challenges. That goes all the way up to marine mammals and whales and others who are now coming closer into shore, maybe to look for food, which means they're interacting more with human industry or fishing gear or other types of things. So we have these big, profound impacts across that. We're seeing more marine heat waves, we're seeing more marine disease, we're seeing more marine harmful algal blooms like red tides and those sorts of things. So everything is feeling these disruptions, and it can all add up to disasters where many species die suddenly, or there are crashes enough. There was a really big one up in Alaska where 10 million snow crab disappeared because of a heat wave. And they maybe cannibalized each other, they may be starved to death, but basically the water got warm enough that they couldn't get enough food. They're used to very cold temperatures, and they just died and disappeared. So that shut down fishing in lots and lots of places. So, at Ocean Conservancy, we work on so many of these issues. We try to take this ecosystem approach. We focus in on how our fisheries are doing and how we can adapt our fishery management to add in precaution, because these impacts are real. They're going to keep happening. They're already happening, and they're only going to get worse. So there's a lot of stuff we can do now to prepare and build resilience in our fisheries, and that has major impacts for everything from the tiny creatures to the really large ones.
Wow, those are very startling examples. Storm, what is something that you think DC policymakers need to understand about communities in Alaska, and also how that relates to the country and even the globe?
One thing DC climate makers need to understand, especially regarding climate change, is how they are affected by it. So Alaska produces 75% of wild-caught salmon in the United States, as well as cod and halibut. So if Alaska fisheries are affected, then the United States is affected. Not just like in some theory, it's food security. So something else I would want DC policymakers to understand is what happened in the village of Newport, which is halfway up western Alaska, and is representative of Alaska, for those of you who don't know. There's a village, and it was wiped out by a typhoon in 2021, which is unheard of in Alaska. That's because of climate change.
Wow. this question is for everyone. What is the most underrated solution that deserves more attention?
Sure, I'll start. So the solution that I think deserves the most attention is the solution that right now is the least people are betting on, essentially. It's like the Wild West. So marine carbon dioxide removal is how you potentially take carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere and you pull it down from the ocean and store it. There's a variety of different types, ranging from things like actually just dumping iron in the ocean to more technology-based solutions that potentially would have less of an impact. So we as an ocean conservation organization, obviously we're not for just dumping things in the ocean, right? We're a conservation organization. But we are for reducing carbon pollution. And so it's an interesting place to sit in a conservation organization and try to figure out what would the research look like. So marine carbon dioxide removal on its own has the potential to reduce 90 gigatons of carbon pollution. That is a lot of carbon pollution. That's like more than we emit. That is a lot of carbon pollution. So much more so than some of the solutions that we're using right now, like offshore wind and renewable energy technology. So somehow you could figure out a way to get this right and balance it in a way where it's not going to actually hurt the ocean, where it's going to work with the chemistry of the ocean and the infrastructure of the ocean, and not against it. Then obviously it'd be a big game changer. But the question is, can we do that? Can we scale it in a way that it's responsible, that it's not running counter to the core of conserving the ocean and making it last? So we're working on that here, basically on the research side, to see what we can do to put potentially guardrails in place, or recently we're working on like a consensus statement between nonprofits to see what we all think would be like smart research, essentially, that would help achieve this in a way that is responsible. So like I said, massive potential if we can get it right, and that's what we're recommending.
When you say the scaling up is one of the challenges, is it like a technological issue, funding issue, like what's one of the biggest challenges in scaling that up?
All of the above, yeah. So right now, if you the financing, you said that, like there's a lot of folks that are doing startups, but they're not able to get to that next phase of actually like demonstration deployment. There's lots of questions around like around safety and around how can you actually do the research in a way that will make it so you're not harming the ocean when you're just doing the research on its own, because it's so unknown. And then of course there's basically there's this wonky London Convention which regulates dumping in the ocean. So that's really the only international regulatory presence right now, which basically says you can't dump iron in the ocean. So people agreed to that about 10 years ago, but since then there's been like no regulatory framework or structure on what this should look like, which is why I call it the Wild West of climate solutions. And so it's a really interesting problem to be part of right now, and hopefully we can figure out a way to, carry it forward responsibly, figure it out, an actual viable solution.
Yeah, fascinating. Meredith, would you like to go with your most underrated climate solution?
Yes, and Fatima will forgive me here, but I think a lot of climate attention is still paid to emissions reduction, and that absolutely needs to happen. We need to do reduction of emissions and to capture and store and all that. I think adaptation as a whole does not get nearly enough attention. We have baked in climate impacts. Even if we stopped emitting now, we have years and decades of climate impacts that we have to address. The things that we can do now to help an ecosystem be more resilient, to help it rebuild, to give some precaution in place, could be the difference between that ecosystem surviving and in some form of an intact nature, getting to the end of what these impacts look like once we get our emissions in place, or not. And so we've taken a really hard look in the fishery space on what are some of the ways, do we have the tools now to do that type of adaptation? And we found over 60 tools in fisheries management that already exist, and nearly half of them could be implemented in the next 1 to 2 years to start making a difference. And so I think it's not that we don't know how to do it, it's that we need to start doing it more than anything else. And so that sticks with me a lot, is that there's so many things we could be doing, and some of them are really small changes, like add a little bit more precautionary buffer into how much we're taking, so that we leave a little bit more fish in so it can recover. Some of it is looking at like how can we create sort of like stoplights for ourselves if we start seeing indicators in the ocean like a sea surface temperature change or a nutrient change. How do we then respond to that in a positive or negative way? Because in fisheries, some species are actually doing better in climate change than in other places. So how do we manage our impact so that we're, if we're fishing more, it's on the ones that are doing well, and how do we kind of adapt around that? So there's a lot of options. It takes a lot of like attention to detail, but some of them are even just simple, like, okay, we'll back off just slightly because we don't know what the risk on some of these things are. So there's a lot for people doing.
Yeah, that's great. And Storm, what is your underrated climate solution?
My underrated climate solution is kelp farming. So kelp puts oxygen in the water and it takes CO2 out of the water. And it's something we start implementing immediately with immediate effects. The reason we don't do it is because it's not very economically viable, especially not compared to Alaska's actual fisheries. So you'd have to produce literal tons. But I would say that's not a bad thing. China produces some 30 billion tons of kelp every single year. And the United States produces like 300,000 tons. So the industry is not established, and it could be, now that have a direct beneficial impact on the water.
Is there a lot of kelp farming around you? What does kelp taste like? I don't know.
Tastes like, it's great. Can't complain, tastes like the ocean. Good nitrogen, really good for farming. That's its primary use, as well as kelp chips. I'm sure some of you have had those. Good on rice. So the oxygen in the water, the nutrients, and then also the habitat creates good breeding grounds for the small fish, and then that works its way all the way up to the bottom of the ecosystem up when you finish. There's a reason people like scuba diving in kelp forests.
We have an audience question. What are some of the specific financial or policy-related barriers to protecting our ocean? Any? Or do we just start with you every time?
Okay. So I wanted to flag a couple of things. In this past year or so, and even just in this last week or so, we continue to see attacks on funding for the National Marine Fisheries Service and for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, with nearly a $1.6 billion cut in the proposed president's budget. I would say underfunding. I always felt like NOAA was underfunded, and now it is even worse than before. It is going to be incredibly difficult to tackle our ocean challenges without the science and expertise that those people brought. The National Marine Fisheries Service, which manages fisheries, lost 550 staff out of 3,000, which is a devastating cut for the type of work that we need to be doing. So that's one thing very much on my mind. I would also say, like, we still have a very single species approach to the way that we manage fisheries, instead of thinking about the ecosystem interactions that exist, and that can get us really bogged down into like the production of exactly one species, and it can limit what fishing communities and others have access to. It also, we all tend to, in America, we eat salmon, shrimp, pollock, and almost nothing else in a lot of places. So some people have never had the local seafood that's available to them, and a lot of that people eat is imported. And so thinking about how to get to local seafood and eat a diverse amount of seafood gives us a lot of ability to come up with more creative solutions and to manage ecosystems as a more whole entity. And my last thing is inertia as a policy issue. So fisheries management in the US has been pretty successful over the last many years, although if you want to spend a lot of time with me, I'll complain about some things. But pretty successful. But the problem is that success makes us think we could keep doing the same thing and still have the same results. And it's very hard to get people to realize that no action is a policy action. Like, keeping on the same thing is a choice that we are making for a less sustainable future. So that's my list.
Janina, do you have anything to add to that list?
always makes me think of like other funding issues in America. I don't know if this is out of place, but when the United States government spends $1 trillion a year on the military and we can't afford to pay teachers for climate change that affects food security, that seems problematic.
Yeah, so for the mitigation side of climate solutions, it kind of depends on the technology, honestly, or the intervention, but that's not a great answer. Definitely financing, funding is an issue. If you look at it all, even just within the climate sphere, like the multilateral climate funds, the green climate fund, the climate investment funds, the acronym soup of international climate financing, there's not much going into ocean climate solutions. And so it's really just hasn't been prioritized, which is unfortunate because ocean climate solutions do have the potential to get us a third of the emission reductions that the planet needs. So prioritizing ocean climate solutions within those multilateral, those international funding is important. It's something we're thinking about here. Someone on my team came up with the idea of a blue finance window, which is essentially like a window that you go up to, essentially that you would prioritize funding ocean climate solutions within the international time frameworks. But then it's also priorities, right? And so talk a little bit about priorities here. And that goes in both ways. So countries have to prioritize ocean climate solutions when they're putting together their international plans. Not all of them do. And I'm reading from my team in the back there some great work starting something called the Blue NDC Challenge, which encourages countries to actually prioritize ocean climate solutions in the plans that they're submitting. And then there's also, just what's happening here. And we're at a great point in the economic trajectory of ocean climate solutions, like offshore wind is actually cost effective to build them. And now we're at the point where, because of difference in priorities, the government's literally paying companies $1 billion not to invest in ocean climate solutions. And so, like I said, it's just a question of what your priorities are and how you put money behind those priorities. And so that's what we're trying to do here is shift those priorities and make it so these things are actually solutions, not only in the US, but abroad.
Another audience question, which areas of the ocean are you seeing the most promising biodiversity advancements?
Yeah, I'll take this one. So I think people are probably familiar with, I should have written down all the words, but the BB&J, so the High Seas Treaty, forgive me, I can Google it with you later, it's many, many, many words. But this is really like an effort internationally to think about and protect biodiversity and to think about how we can do things like consider what our environmental impacts will be before we do certain industry or other sort of activities in the high seas, which are most of the ocean. Also thinking about bringing like additional like habitat protections or other sorts of those things to these issues. I'm gonna have fun with this actually for a second though. Give you like I got the opportunity to go to the University of California, Davis to their white abalone recovery lab. So white abalone is a incredibly endangered species, essentially nearly extinct in the wild. And many years ago, they collected a few of them out of the wild, and they used to be like a major food source for indigenous communities. And we basically commercially fished them to death up on the West Coast in California. And so people collected like a few remaining ones, right? And they brought them into a lab, and they were like, we have no idea how to make these reproduce, essentially. They're broadcast spawners, which means they have to be located next to each other in order to successfully reproduce out in the wild. And so they had this whole program, and they started off, they had all these, and they completely failed. Like, they could not figure out how to get them to reproduce. They all managed to get like some sort of disease because the water was not, like one of the marine diseases that I told you about, like got into their supply, and they're like, what do we do? So we moved them to another facility. They cleaned them up, they got them healthy again. They actually figured out how to make these reproduce. They're now in the middle of like their 9th or 10th year of outplanting, which they do with local communities in order to like get them out there. And we're on the edge of like, will we see them reproducing in the wild? Will we start to see the evidence of those? And like, that's the kind of thing, marine species have so much ability to recover if we can figure out and bring them together and like bring some amazing science science, and the people there are incredible. I had so much fun wandering around their weird bubbling tanks. They will show you like the grossest thing you've ever seen and be like, look how cute it is. And I'm like, it's adorable. And so like, yeah, there really is like, we can solve these problems and we can restore biodiversity to these ecosystems if we give it the time and attention and let the scientists have fun and also let them fail and then try again. Like there's a lot that can be done there. And they learned also from a lot of the communities who had interacted with that species for a long time, and that gave them some additional information that helped them be successful. And now they're working with them to bring those back into the ecosystem. So like those are the types of things in biodiversity that make me so excited, because you can really like solve these real problems with community and science and everything.
Yeah, that's great. Do either of you have another inspiring?
Sorry, I got too excited about like that one.
Promising biodiversity. The most promising biodiversity I've seen in Kodiak in the water comes from the sea line protected zones, based solely on the fact that trawlers cannot go and tear apart those territories. So like those territories where fisheries can't access are keeping alive other fisheries. Also, side note, the infections that she's talking about, harmful algal blooms, red tide is one that we have in Kodiak in Alaska, and it turns the waves red and it affects all the mussels and clams too. You can't eat them, they're harmful toxic. And that's becoming like more and more prevalent each year. Can you guys hear me in the back? Am I very good?
All right, the next audience question is, let's see. What are some less talked about but also major consequences that could happen if certain fish populations continue to be overfished?
No, I don't want to.
I mean, an overfished fish population is at a level where it's not producing enough to really sustain and rebuild its population to a healthy level. With climate change affecting all of our ecosystems right now, being in an overfished state is like really putting a target on that stock to like, will it be able to endure warmer waters, more acidified waters, less oxygen in the water, and so it's just in a fragile state, which fisheries they're hard to like entirely collapse. It's hard to endangered species of fishery, but like they're so fragile at that state that it can easily be that they collapse and they can't recover well enough. And what you really lose there is the communities and the people who depend upon that stock, either for food security or for commercial activity or recreation or cultural practice. Because once it's gone, it's really difficult to come back. And people don't think about the fact that like, okay, it collapses, maybe it comes back, but we've lost the infrastructure in the area, like the processing plant where the ports may have closed down, the boats have been sold. There's no market demand for it anymore because it disappeared and then people forget to go and eat it later. And so it can have these long-term devastating effects to people if a stock it collapses. And so one of the things in the US that it's written in the laws that we are required to rebuild all of our stocks to healthy levels. We're actually struggling right now to rebuild a lot of stocks. Many of the stocks in rebuilding plans right now, I think nearly 2/3 of them in a rebuilding plan are making no progress in rebuilding the health of the stock. And I think a lot of that is because we're not bringing these ecological and ecosystem considerations into account enough when we're rebuilding those. It's a little bit of a rant, but
Yeah, Storm, do you see this in Alaska, like for the salmon populations, for example? Is it threaten the food security there? What consequences have you seen on the local level?
Absolutely. One of the salmon species that's become overfished is the king salmon population. Some would consider it as collapsed. It's greatly diminished, and all the native communities directly rely on the salmon population. So in Kodiak, I've seen as the temperature gets warmer and warmer, small streams dry up, bigger rivers get warm. That'll affect the eggs. The eggs will die, and then you don't get a return on salmon. So you'll see on the smaller rivers, the water is not, on the hot summers, the water is not strong enough for the fish to make it upstream. So that happens like every couple of years, but if that were to happen 2 or 3 or 4 years in a row, then that fish would collapse entirely. And then, speaking of which, the king crab fishery was overfished in Kodiak. We used to have like a very abundant king crab fishery, and it was overfished, and they have not returned.
Have they pivoted to something else, or is that just a gaping hole that's?
The king crab fishery in Kodiak is entirely gone. So, overfished and have not been able to recover. Just to illustrate your points.
Another audience question: what approaches have you found to be the most effective for engaging climate change deniers in productive conversations about how climate change affects fish population dynamics and the ocean? So I'm sure you all love to do that.
I mean, I'll jump in. Let me introduce you to fisheries. It's fascinating because a lot of fishermen, and I do want to say in the US we tend to use the term fishermen, and actually I've spoken to a lot of women who fish and that's their preferred term, so I just want to be clear why I'm using what feels like a less inclusive term because I come from the US background. So you talk to fishermen and they will tell you that things are changing on the water. They see that. And if you talk to them about it from the impacts, the stock has shifted, it's moved, it's not where it was before, or there's a marine disease outbreak or a heat wave. Like you can talk to them about the actual impacts and still come to the point of having a collective shared goal of addressing the impact. And in some places in the country, you should never say the word climate change during that conversation, but we can still do the adaptation work together. And so you kind of have to choose, like, is this a fight I want to have right now? Or is the outcome that I want to actually have the policy change or the change on the water? So you kind of pick who you want to argue with, or if it's important to argue about it, or if the solution is more important. Now there are other places, a lot of fishermen that I work with this is probably a little absurd to say, but like they see climate change, they believe in climate change, they know what it is and that it's happening, and they are bigger champions for it maybe than even I am, because it affects their everyday, it affects the places that they are in, it affects the fisheries, and they can see it, every fish that they catch, that it's changed in some way. And so some of them can be enormous champions for this work, for the change that we need, but there are other ones of them who just want to say, like, yeah, the stock's not where it used to be, and you say, what can we do about that? And that's sort of how you figure it out in that space to build those relationships.
Yeah, I've seen that too in my own reporting, like on the Eastern Shore, they have a lot of saltwater intrusion issues. But if you say that might be because of climate change, they'll say, no, it's just erosion. They'll use a different word for it, but you still all kind of agree that this is a problem, these are the steps that need to be taken.
Yes, and I think one really interesting thing about that is that climate change makes every existing problem worse. And so, like, yes, there was probably erosion and saltwater intrusion before, and climate change is making it worse, but maybe they don't want to add the climate change aspect onto it. Maybe they're still comfortable talking about it with like nutrient pollution runoff or those sorts of things. Like you can get them at the places and you could be like, it does seem like it's getting worse. And they're like, yes, it does. And then you come up with the solution and you maybe don't always have to fight the climate change fight. That being said, sometimes you must fight the climate change fight because that is an existential threat to the things that we care about and to the ocean. So you do have to pick your battles, and you have to know who you want to pick that battle with.
Have you ever picked that battle and won?
Occasionally. I would say, we do a lot of like education up on the Hill, and I will say, in a closed room, you can have that. You can figure that out with the right people, Republican or Democrat, etc. And then sometimes when it has to be written down someplace else, they don't want to write all the same words. But you can have those conversations with them in those rooms that, like, this is a climate change thing. And they're like, okay. So yeah, sure. You can build that with them.
Do either of you have anything to add on your approaches, your beliefs?
Yeah, but exactly like you said, is it worth engaging someone who's a denier, right? For I guess perhaps they haven't seen the information. would say, like you said, you can kind of go around the climate change thing, and so like with kelp, I would say we need to do it because it is pulling CO2 out of the water, so our shellfish don't dissolve, and they would be like, yeah, whatever. And if they did say that, I would be like, well, there's money to be made. And then they'd give the thumbs up. So if we come to the same solution for different reasons, then that's a winner.
Yeah, exactly. It's just, I found the same thing in my work. How do you make something applicable to people? How do you meet them where they are? How do you show them how it will impact their family, their livelihoods themselves? Not these like abstract issues, which is how we first started talking about climate change. It'll impact future generations. And then we realized that's helps motivate some people, but it doesn't help motivate everyone. It's actually like how does it impact you personally? You don't even need to say the word climate. How does it impact your family? And when you find that common ground, then you can make real change. For me, in like the course of my career, the place I was able to do that the easiest was around the farm bill and farming in the U.S. because people can see what's happening to their farmland. You can talk similar to the ocean, and so it's easy to make that case without talking about climate change.
You all have, usually when you hear about ocean and climate change, it can get very depressing. And you have said many depressing things. But you also said some very surprisingly positive things as well. I guess just to kind of end, why should we have hope?
I feel like I've gone personal a bunch of times.
No, that's great. Okay, so
It's a very me problem.
I'll start with, or I'll finish with where I started. So if you think about the ocean as a whole, it's the oldest technological infrastructure that we have. It's the largest, right? So for me, and why I work here is because I've worked on climate change for nearly 20 years now, and I've done a number of different topics. And the thing that I feel like there's the most uncharted territory around, the most solutions around is the ocean. And so I honestly, genuinely believe that if we can get this right, if we can take the work that we've already been doing on ocean climate solutions and adaptation also, and level it up and really create a more cohesive infrastructure around it, that we can really solve the world's largest challenge. And this is a one piece, and so that's what we can hope that if we get this right, we can actually make a really, really big progress.
I'll go next. Like, I'm in the middle, so I always have to go second. Say the question again. So hope is what, if you don't have any hope, then you won't bother recycling your cans and bottles. If you do have hope, then you will, and if all of us do that, then there's the grounds for hope, to have hope. So that's why I would say that people should have hope.
I get to work in fisheries, which I think is so cool. So if anybody wants to, again, spend way too much time to be talking about fish, I'm happy to do it. The thing that's so cool about wild captured fisheries is that it is a place where human industry and cultures and activity depend entirely on a wild ecosystem. There is no other large-scale food source that exists that feeds people that is so integrally connected to wild, healthy ecosystems. And that gives us a place where people and like the interests of people and the interest of a healthy ecosystem align in a way that they kind of don't in a lot of other places. Like fishermen are incredible conservationists, and they need a lot of fish in the ocean so that they can catch a lot of fish. Like there's just a direct alignment there. And so what we've seen is that you can leverage those relationships that we all to achieve good conservation outcomes in a way where sometimes it's not that we don't butt heads or anything, but there's an alignment with an industry and with a group of people that maybe doesn't happen in a lot of other parts of the environment. And I think that's really special. That gives me a lot of hope. That's why I work in fisheries, is because of that alignment. But I also want to point out that we know that we have previously devastated lots of marine species, from whales to sea lions to turtles to all kinds of things, to coral, good luck. But we're rebuilding those things too, right? And so the cool thing about the ocean is it has such a deep ability to regenerate it has inherent resilience. It has the ability still to move around in a way that like on land species don't really have. And I think it gives us a lot of opportunity that like with the right care and partnerships and structures and backing off when we need to, we can actually have this wild, healthy ecosystem even as we are really damaging it right now, but it can come back, right? And we have to give it the best possible chance to come back, and that's what like we are being called to do right now, I think, is really like, what can we do so that it can come back? Because it's gonna get worse for a little while, probably, but how do we minimize that so it has the best possible chance to recover? And so that's where I see a lot of hope, because I know everything we can do now charts us towards one of our better future paths. Even if it's like a small thing that we do now, it puts us in the realities, the future realities that are better. And so any little piece matters right now, in my opinion. So that's what gives me hope.
Yeah, that's great. We have a few more minutes, so we can take some live audience questions as well. Just raise your hand while people are thinking of Canada.
I wanted to ask about the nonprofit consensus that you're trying to come to and the scientific research that you're looking at to change policy. Tell me more about what kind of research and what are the conversations you're looking at?
The one I mentioned earlier. Yeah, so we're marine carbon dioxide removal is one of the things I talked about here. The research and how you do the research is really important, right? And done so responsibly, because it's such a wildlife and it's there's potential to potentially have devastating impact. So a few years ago do you remember what year, Anne-Marie? Like 2023? Yeah, we got a lot of the major nonprofits together and talked to them about what they thought would be alignment around, what would be forward-looking principles around SDR, like how can we all agree on the things that we are for in terms of defining research. And so a lot of things have changed since 2023, and so we reconvened that group with a few others and are working on finalizing now what that would look like today, given the changing context and dynamic. Okay, so from our comms team, hopefully it will see that.
I have a question, yeah. I've read that, I heard that, some countries are going into the southern oceans and, fishing that are taking up a lot of the, kelp, or not the kelp, the,
Krill.
yes.
Yes. And are you just worried about the impacts of that generally?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think that we have the right right science and catch limits and stuff in place in those regions to feel confident that won't have a major impact. So I do think there are some real concerns about how much they're taking. Do we have the right governance structures in place to control that? And I don't think that we do. So there certainly are. I work mostly in the U.S. context. We have quite a lot of laws, one law, but a lot of regulation about how we manage our fisheries. It's much more patchwork out in the high seas, and so yeah, it's a really tricky place. We definitely do not have the issue of overfishing solved in many parts of the ocean. So yeah, it's a real challenge. And krill is like a major low level food for
Right.
the whole food web.
Exactly, yeah.
So that can have really profound impacts.
And are you involved at all in all the fish factory farming that's going on all over the world?
Are we
Do you handle that at all, or?
Well, some of the work that we're doing lately is looking at trying to make sure there's a part of the ocean called the mesopelagic, quite deep, also called the ocean twilight zone. And one of the things that Ocean Conservancy is working on is trying to make sure that that same sort of factory reduction fishing that you're talking about does not start for the species that exist down there. Up until now, it's been really difficult for people to fish in those areas because they're quite deep. There's a huge amount of biodiversity and fish and other things down in that feed many species as well as people, up the chain. And so there are more and more efforts to try to colonize fishing into that area in order to extract that and then reduce it down for fish meal or fish oil or those sorts of products. And so there's a lot of work being done internationally right now to try to precautionarily protect those areas so that that kind of fishing does not happen, so that we don't replicate some of these mistakes that we're seeing in other places.
I have a question. I know you mentioned the high seas treaty that I won't go like in the detail of the whole thing.
So many
too long.
letters. Do you know them?
No.
Okay.
I call it the high seas treaty.
Yeah.
But I know there's also the 30 by 30 initiative.
Yes.
So I wanted to ask you, like, how do you see this like momentum around the ocean impacting the way that you do your work here at a national level, also at a local level?
Yeah. I think 30 by 30 and those things are interestingly, I think they are really important. Closing areas like that are really important, particularly in areas that have weak governance structures already. So if you don't have like a robust fishery management system and a bunch of science going into place around those things, it becomes even more critical that you set aside some areas and you're like, okay, well at least we won't go in here, because that provides a level of precaution for those places. In the US, it's been more difficult to do those types of closed areas because of the way that our fisheries management system tends to work. But we are also one of the better managed sets of fisheries in the world, and so it's kind of plus and minus there. But I do know there's a lot of efforts in the US to find those like very special places, like places with high level of relief or interesting habitat areas, and protect them as well. So that work is also ongoing.
And it's also helpful from my work because we can say, okay, that's a protected area, like a 30 by 30 protected area, so we probably shouldn't be building offshore wind in that area, right? So it's actually helpful from a policy.
And just to interject, PBNJ treaty stands for.
Thank you, oh my gosh.
It is a long one,
Yes.
and it's not logical.
No.
The agreement on marine biological diversity of areas beyond national jurisdiction.
Thank you. I can't, it doesn't spell the letters.
That's your Jeopardy factor.
Thank you, I can't keep it in my brain.
It's a song.
Something, yeah, some kind of mnemonic or whatever, yeah.
I think you had your hand up first.
Yeah, back to MCR, so you're talking about you're having a lot of conversations with NGOs. What about, have you had conversations with bringing in two private actors who are in the space, or the standards bodies, or even the UN Article 6?
For sure. So I talked about NGOs, just the word NGO, but we actually started something called the MCR Forum a few weeks ago, maybe a month ago now, where we're bringing together industry, academia, and NGOs to try to have this broader conversation, because we know, and I know like, from my work previously, that if we don't have the conversations with the industry, build trust with them, learn from them, then we're not going to be relevant in this conversation. So 1000%, we actually had a closer conversation during New York Climate Week last year with a group of industry players. We wanted to learn what do they think, how do they think NGOs can be helpful, how do they think NGOs are blocking things and being unhelpful. So for sure, definitely are wanting to and trying to actively engage with the private sector here, because we all have to figure this out together. Sure. Great question.
One of the lesser known ecosystems are the deep water coral reefs, some of which are off Florida, but they're in different places. Are there any efforts to try to study and map these more and to protect them from deep sea mining and bottom trawling, especially since there's a big interest in deep sea mining now?
Yeah, gosh, I'm not the deep sea mining person to ask, but there definitely are efforts across the U.S. ocean to do a lot more mapping. Some of those are being done by NGOs. Some of that is the government itself doing the mapping. Now, between us, a lot of that government mapping really is to look for places for deep sea mining or other sorts of things, and so it's not like altruistic mapping of the seafloor that they're up to. So people can take that data and do work to try to then protect those places. So there are a number of deep sea coral areas that have received some protection, and then quite often someone then tries to roll back that protection. One thing that I will say is there's often a perception that trawlers want to go into those areas. Trawlers don't want to catch their nets on coral, and so quite often they don't want to be there, but there is a real threat, I think, of deep sea mining and other sorts of activities in those areas. So Definitely, I don't think we understand the seafloor nearly enough to know where those special places are to protect them. So I think that's a real challenge. There is deep sea coral up in Alaska and stuff too, though. Like you guys have those deep environments as well. Do you know of anything going on up in those areas as well to keep the trawlers out or any of the protection and stuff? Not to put you on the spot, but I just thought you could add something because you're closer to these ecosystems than I am.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure if the trawlers, when I think deep water, I'm thinking like 600 fathoms for black cod. You catch like, occasionally, the hooks don't destroy the bottom the way nets do, but
Right.
you'll pull up like corals, fans, and what's the other ones? Sponges, sea whips.
Yeah.
That's a colloquial, so sorry about that, I don't know their actual names. But I'm not sure if trawlers fish those territories, based off the fact that it's so deep.
I had a follow-up question for the funding question that someone asked earlier. You all have mentioned that funding, at NOAA and then other places are not, and that people are getting laid off. Are you seeing, and I hope this turns into a hopeful answer, are you seeing other places compensate for those funding losses, or how are you making up what we're losing now with these cuts?
Meredith's our NOAA person, so if it's a NOAA question, she should answer, so I can talk to her from.
Or like international, or like more international support?
I don't have a hopeful answer for you in the NOAA context, so if you want a different, or maybe the US context. So the hopeful thing I'm seeing, I guess, is the recognition that there has been such a profound loss, which hopefully gets us to the point where we can come up with solutions later. And I see people forming communities around that, understanding that they have depended upon this type of funding or this research and they don't have it anymore. I can connect this back to the white abalone story I spent too much time on previously, which is like that program was entirely NOAA funded for a really long time, and when the budget freezes and everything went in place, they started separately fundraising to try to support that, because any break in funding there means we basically lose an entire species. And the community did come together, the university there helped promote them and promote that story, and they basically found like one human being with money who was like, I will give you money for this, and that kept them afloat for enough time that they're managing to come up with some other ways to fundraise. But it really is those community and then moments of extreme generosity that is filling some of the gap, and some of that is luck. So I don't have the world's most hopeful answer around that at this moment. I'm deeply concerned about what it looks like to do this type of work. I know you said hopeful, but one more thing that I'm sad about is that I really worry we're losing a whole generation of people coming into this work, because the places that are getting most cut in losing the NOAA budget, but then losing university funding and cooperative institutes and those sort of things, it's the young entry-level science positions that we're losing. And these are all brilliant kids who can go do finance or whatever if that's the only option available to them, but they wanted to do something for the ocean, and it's so much harder for them to find those spaces now, and that breaks my heart, because we need those people to come tell me what the better solutions are soon, and I think we're losing some of those folks. Sorry, okay, happy answer?
So I think yes, there are individual people that are standing up and trying to fill in some of the holes, but if you even put them all together, I mean, I used to work at the Office of Management and Budget, I managed a $300 billion budget. There are zeros missing. Even if you add up all the individual donors together, you can't make up what the federal government would do, and the federal government's there because it's a commons, right? And they're supposed to make up where the industry and the private sector can't actually raise money, right? So that's a problem that we can't solve with a bunch of individual folks, unfortunately. In terms of hopefulness, though, at the international level, we are seeing, I talked about this finance window, which our team's starting, where we're trying to engage folks and have some of the international financing organizations prioritize ocean climate solutions, and people are interested. People think it's cool. They want to do more. So that's hopeful to us. We're doing more work on that, and if anyone's interested in this help out, we're super excited about it. So we are seeing a lot more momentum internationally, which is good.
Great. All right, we have time for maybe one quick question. So you're going to be the final say in everything. May I the best question ever.
No pressure.
No pressure. My question is, you're working internationally, you're working nationally in DC and whatnot, and your man's living from a coastal community that is a fishing dependent community. Are you guys able to introduce the people who are either collaborating with, working with, and who have the ability to make some differences into those communities so that they can see who is being directly impacted?
Yes, it's one of our favorite things to do as much as we are able to. I often work to try to find fishermen or other affected community people and bring them into DC and take them to their members of Congress or others so that they can hear directly from it. And in the fisheries space, it's quite often when I'm in those meetings, the staffers will say, this is the first time I've actually heard from someone who fishes who comes to talk to me about fishing, and it makes the huge difference. I think that we're not as good at the reciprocal getting things back into the community as we are maybe bringing people to speak in the places where we're comfortable, and I think we need to do more to go be uncomfortable in some of those places and to make those connections. And to anytime I've been to Kodiak, it's one of my favorite. I didn't want to leave. It's an amazing, special place. It will change your life to be there. And I don't think we have enough of those connections. And the way I sort of cling to those as a place that grounds me when I do this work, I'm kind of desperate and sad. I'm just I was once in a place where actual fishing was happening instead of just DC. I think those are incredibly important connections to make. And I think in a lot of ways we need continual feedback on how to do those things better and to make more time for those, because I don't think we do that enough, but it is, I think, a huge priority for many of us. And I think we know that resources into those communities can make an enormous difference, even small amounts of resources in, and getting to the people who are closest to the water and who understand that are, that's where real change can happen too. So I think it's a big part of what we want to do more of, and it's a part of how we want to do this work.
Yeah, and at the international level, we work to do that in multiple different ways. So one, when there are these large UN bodies or non-UN bodies, like right now, negotiating, a shipping target, a lot of countries aren't involved. So we actually, one of our programs has targeted Latin American countries to try to get them involved in actually speaking at the negotiations table or writing papers or submitting things or talking on behalf of themselves at the negotiating table, not having us speak on behalf of other countries about what they want. So that's thing one at the national government level in terms of negotiations and high level wonkiness. But then also, when there are, it's obviously important to have the national government there, but it's also important to have the people that are impacted. So another thing we do is we help tie together when there are these large multilateral gatherings, people that are actually impacted from small island developing states, so that they can actually participate and go and speak about what's happening to them in real time. So that's something we'd love to do more of, but we try to do it as much as we can. But then I think the most interesting thing is the group that you're part of. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, the Tuutalik cohort, it's indigenous youth from across the Arctic Circle. Greenland, Canada, I'm part of the Alaska group, and Finland. We all got together to do, it's like networking. We're discussing the future of our territories, what it looks like, the problems that we're facing, the success that we've had.